The church at Stanley was one of three which was built in the ancient parish of Wakefield, an extensive parish which included Wakefield itself, Alverthorpe-cum-Thorne, Stanley-cum-Renthorpe, and indeed Horbury. It was felt at the end of the Napoleonic War period that it was desirable to build considerable numbers of new Church of England churches throughout England. And in 1818, Parliament granted £1 million for this purpose, and indeed passed an Act, a copy of which I've got in front of me here, called an Act for Building and Promoting the Building of Additional Churches in Populous Parishes. The £1 million which was set aside for this purpose was the reason that the new churches so constructed were called Million Fund churches. Wakefield was eventually to get three of these. Stanley was the first, Alverthorpe came quickly afterwards, and Thorns a little later, at the end of the 1820s. The Wakefield newspaper tells us that the foundations for the new church at Stanley were beginning to be dug in the middle of 1820. The architects who were chosen were Atkinson and Sharp of York, well-known architects at that time, and in 1821 they invited tenders from contractors for the building of the new churches at Alverthorpe and at Stanley. And in fact I've got the original specification here, which was sent out to would-be contractors. The foundation stone of the new church at Stanley was laid in the September of 1821 by a local bigwig, Francis Maud, and the new church went ahead very quickly, and in 1824 the church and the adjoining churchyard, and the churchyard was important because of the lack, which was felt quite markedly at that time, of burial space in the parish of Wakefield. The church and churchyard were consecrated by the Archbishop of York in the September of 1824, the opening sermon at Stanley being preached by the then Vicar of Wakefield. The siting of the church at Stanley is quite interesting, indeed in a way unusual. Stanley comprises a number of hamlets. The hamlet of Stanley itself lay at the bottom of Stanley Hill, around the end of Ferry Lane on the Wakefield and Aberford Road. But a site was chosen at Lake Lock for the building of the new church, and that was chosen, and the documents survive in my collection here, it was chosen because the land was given by one John Lee, who was a Wakefield lawyer, and who in the 1790s, under very similar circumstances, had given a site for the building of what was to become St John's Church in Wakefield. And he'd given that site with a view to developing houses around it, and of course St John's Square and St John's Street, as it was originally called, St John's North as we know it, were erected as part of a development plan on the part of John Lee. Lee also envisaged the building of houses around the new church on the site which he was to give at Lake Lock. In fact, the houses never came into being. But the new church was erected, the Archbishop consecrates it. It was a church very different to that which we have known recently. It was a large barn of a place, and only subsequently were there to be aisles constructed within the old structure. The church, upon its building, had cost £12,191, which in our terms sounds quite modest, but in those of earlier days was a very substantial sum indeed. The original church of 1824 consecration date, was to survive, altered internally, until a great fire occurred in 1911. That destroyed the whole of the internal structure of the church, and work had to begin on rebuilding part of the structure and the whole of the internal fittings. The external structure of 1824 was somewhat altered with the rebuilding after the 1911 fire. Under the church, originally, were constructed burial catacombs, as indeed were such catacombs constructed under the similarly dated Million Fund Church at Alverthorpe. These were for the more well-to-do to be buried in and to have their families there buried. And remains of these catacombs, although altered for modern purposes, have survived under Stanley Church into our own day. So the Stanley Church, which we know today, is one which in part includes the old church opened in 1824, but is very largely a rebuilding of the church resultant upon the fire of 1911. So effectively a church of the early years of the reign of George V, rather than the first church, which was erected in the reign of King George IV.